don't let fear take over you. A lot of these channels and a lot of people who have good intentions and they share good information do play into fear, whether they want it or not. And fear kind of locks you down or makes you do unwise decisions.
Saturday, July 17th, 2021, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Star Path Academy. Well, Arpad, that's his name. And I was referred to Star Path Academy first by my wife. She said, "Oh, this guy's really good. He used to live in Romania. He's talking about hyperinflation." And then I got quite a few comments from the viewers in the comment section about Star Path Academy. And as many of you know, I've been covering the monetary system, the fiat currency system. I've spoken a lot about the hyperinflations we've seen historically, but from listening to a lot of Arpad's videos on Star Path Academy, I feel he has a really good grasp on explaining his experience, basically surviving economic collapse, hyperinflation in 1990s Romania. And even though I grew up in Brazil and I was there during inflationary times, my experiences were very different. I think Brazil didn't suffer as much maybe as Romania. So lately I've been asked by a lot of viewers, what can we do during hyperinflation? And I thought, what better person to have than Star Path Academy? So welcome, Arpad, on the channel, and thanks for accepting my invitation.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here on your channel, and thank you for the invite.
You're welcome. So let's start first, maybe with a little bit of history about Romania, because a lot of people maybe don't know the history. They don't know that Romania was under communism from basically after World War II up until 1989. And then Ceausescu was, of course, deposed in 1989. I remember that really well, being, in my 50s, the photos of him and his wife, how they got rid of Ceausescu. But the thing about revolutions and when things change, you don't know what you're going to get. So maybe you can go over a little bit the history of your own country. You know a lot better than I do. So we can from there explain what happened in Romania.
Sure thing. So very good introduction. That's exactly true. Since the Second World War has ended, Romania has become a communist country, and we had two rulers, and the second one was Ceausescu, and the rule ended on 89, the end of 89, and before that, Romania was a monarchy, so we had a king, and it was totally different. Everything changed since the Second World War. When I talk about my experiences and my family's experiences, I like to bring up that my family went through multiple hyperinflations, especially my grandfather and father. So there was a hyperinflation during Second World War, definitely, and the cause of the Second World War. Some parts of Romania were parts of Hungary back then. So I talk about the hyperinflation of the Hungarian currency, the pengu, which my grandmother and my grandfather talked a lot about, not knowing, of course, that during 89 and the 90s we will experience another hyperinflation. So I have a lot of stories from both of these eras, and of course the 89s and the 90s, the hyperinflation in Romania was not even close to that levels. However, it was enough to kind of reset everything and everyone to a very basic, very poor level. And this came with also the regime change and the economic change of Romania turning from a communist country into, well, some would like to call a capitalist, but it was more of a socialist government that was installed. And so I just wanted to mention that these calamities like hyperinflation usually come also with political changes, and that was definitely true in the 48 and the 50s, and also in the 90s of Romania. So after the execution of Ceausescu and in 89, there was a couple of months of euphoria in the country. A lot of people felt that we were liberated, that a lot of good things are coming now to Romania. And before that, we had periodic lockdowns. We had a lot of restrictions during communism. So the flashpoint of the hyperinflation was definitely the execution of Ceausescu. And it took us sort of 6 months to experience the high inflation that has started and the restructuring of the economy. And I'd like to mention that it was a 4-0 inflation. That means that the currency lost 10,000 of its value, basically something that would have cost 1 lei during, or maybe even less than 1 lei. In early 90s, by the 7 years of hyperinflation, the cost of that was around 10,000. So four zeros was the difference. And that comes a lot of that also means that if you had savings in the bank, we only had one bank, everything was nationalized and centralized. It was the CEC. It was a central bank, which eventually got a bank holiday, and the capital was locked in there. And by the time you could get that money, the value of it was inflated away. So if you had a $10,000 or Romanian lei, what we had in the bank during that time, by the time you could have got it out, it purchased just around a loaf of bread by the time everything ended.
So I guess the inflation started in the early 90s after Ceausescu was gotten rid of, and basically it took 7 years really it accelerated and culminated in 97. And it's interesting that you said that there were lockdowns and the economy was shut down after a revolution. Which seems to be what is happening now. And you also noted that you only had one bank. It was the central bank. And what we're seeing, especially here in Europe, for example, in the UK, we only have 4 or 5 big banks. After the 2008 crisis, a lot of banks collapsed. One of the big banks, RBS, was taken over by the government. It's now called NatWest, but it's basically I think it's 60% owned still by the government. So, and we're hearing now talk of getting central bank digital currencies, almost as if we're going the reverse of what you guys went through, and that they want us to be dependent on one central bank. That doesn't bode well to me. What are your thoughts on that?
Definitely. So when I have my videos or shows about the hyperinflation in Romania and how our families fared during those times, or even society, how it was changed, I mention it oftentimes that it was going from a very controlled state into a more liberalized, and in classical sense of liberty, liberalized economy. Whereas now I feel, and most people would agree with me, I hope, that we're actually turning back. The pendulum is swinging back towards a more controlled, more centralized economies, more government-controlled economies. So when I talk about what could have been good investments or strategies during that time, well, definitely the calamities would be similar at the people level, on shortages and so on. What would follow, in my opinion, there are differences between the two scenarios. And I do feel that a future hyperinflation would also be somewhat globalized, instead of what we had, a localized economy, a satellite state of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and I have spoken many times, and I have a few books that I tell people to read about the death of money and others like fiat money inflation in France. The death of money is about Weimar hyperinflation. It does talk as well about the hyperinflation in other Central European countries like Austria and even Hungary, I think, after World War I. And in France, it was the same thing in the 1790s. You had the assignats, you had a collapse of the currency there, and they were all related to big political events. In 1790s, you just had the French Revolution. In 1919, the German emperor had abdicated. Germany became a republic. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed as well. So, and the more I look at things these days, even in the UK, in the US, in France, where we've been having all these protests for the last 3 years, it seems to me that there's a lot of social unhappiness about the political system. There's a lot of division as well of the public. So, and we have as well the monetary policy, the central banks printing a lot of money for the last 50 years, and especially since 2008 and last March, we have the government's borrowing trillions of dollars. So I would say that from what I've studied and what I've experienced in my life, in the West, we haven't had as good, recipes for hyperinflation as we have now, because some people think hyperinflation is when costs go up very quickly. Yes, they do go up, but it's more a loss of confidence in the political system that issue that currency.
I completely agree on that. That was our feel on the street as well. Of course, the effect of it was costs going up, and that kind of went into a self-feeding loop where if the products are of some certain companies that they are selling are going up in price, at some point you have to wonder how much better it is actually not to sell it or sell it towards a later point, which again drives up shortages, drives up price again, and so on. So prices did have their sort of waves of going up, and it was always going up. But what we felt, what the average people on the street felt, was actually losing faith in the currency that you have, because you would know that as soon as you got your pay, if you still had a job, you would run and physically run on your feet to the store to immediately spend it and buy something, because you would know that 2 weeks from now, 1 month from now, the same amount would buy less. So the confidence was lost. And also at some point, the confidence in government was lost that they could actually help us, quote unquote, help us. A lot of people did look for government to solve this issue. And while we can talk about high inflation and what tools government has to kind of slow inflation down or that sort of stuff, once your confidence is lost in the government to solve the issue, their tools are very limited. Because at that point, no matter what they do, you still won't believe it. A lot of like the central banks, the Fed, the Federal Reserve in the United States, it's also perception management is one of their best tools. Yes, of course, they can contract and they can expand the currency supply, but as you saw, especially in the last couple of years, it's actually them talking about what will they do in 2 years, managing the perception of the free market, trying to manage, of course. If that would be lost between the free market and government, their tools would be much, much less effective, and people would not care, because they would rather have that, whatever they can buy, may it be a house, may it be gold and silver, may it be whatever, even farming equipment, you would rather have that now instead of whatever they promise what they would do in 2 years, 5 years, or whatever.
Yeah, I think the Fed is playing a very dangerous game. They keep saying that the rising prices that we're seeing now, and I use the term rising prices because I think inflation is something that's created by government and the central bank. It's when they make credit and money very accommodative, where they try to manipulate the natural rate of interest in the market. It's also because we've been off a sound money system for almost 50 years now. The anniversary, of course, is August 15th. And we've had this inflationary environment, and now we're starting to see it move into basic commodities, basic consumer goods. And if you look at the ownership of wealth in the United States, and even here probably, it's like the top 10% that own almost 90% of all the stocks and bonds. And that kind of inflation, the inflation that they've created is flown into those financial assets. But I now think it's turning and flowing into these consumer goods. And the general public, we're starting to see, not just in the States, we're starting to see shortages. They're telling us the shortages are because of the health crisis that we've had, but that might be slightly so. But I think it's a little bit to do with all the money and credit they created in the last year or so. I mean, people subconsciously, I think business people, they see when there's something wrong, they hold back.
Yeah, so regarding shortages, we experienced that even during communism. In one way or another, that was actually somewhat good because people were more prepared for calamities, because it was normal for us to have shortages here and there. So the pantries were much more stocked than how a Western society has it right now, the average person in the Western society. So in that sense, we actually had a better chance of going into hyperinflation, and also the trust in media was already lost. So at some point, the prices or indicators in newspapers or something like that would not mean anything for us, because everything would have two price, one noted down somewhere in a newspaper, but also the street price would be completely different, and that would mean regions and everything would be different based on different regions, what they produced, and it was just the breakdown of economy. So in some way, inflation or slow inflation can help. Well, there are opinions that they can help businesses, and if it's, of course, a slow rate of inflation, it can help businesses grow, take on credit and pay it off later at a cheaper price. However, as soon as that inflection point happens to hyperinflation, it becomes totally a different game, and a lot of the industry of Romania broke down within weeks. It's very hard for businesses, and especially factories and those who produce stuff, to manage these situations. And of course, not even talking about our own currency depreciating against foreign currencies, we would no longer be able to import anything. So it's a totally different situation than what a high inflation would mean.
Yeah, and I guess being under communism for so long and having shortages was, I guess, a kind of a blessing in disguise, so that you could prepare for the hyperinflation. Not that it was great, and maybe that's what they're trying to do to us. They know that we're going to get hyperinflation, and they're using this crisis as a cover for shortages. And I mean, here in the UK, in the last week, they have this app. It's called the NHS app, that people have, millions of people have downloaded it, and they get notified if they were close to someone who tested positive. And in the last week or so, this app has gone crazy, and a lot of businesses are having a tough time because people are not going to work. So yeah, I think there's some of that going on. But listening to a lot of your videos, I found the interesting thing is that no matter what happens in an economic collapse or hyperinflation, because hyperinflation is just a collapse of money and currency, and money and currency, they're a human creation, and they're very easy to, I think, once confidence collapses and the system breaks down, it's easy to start again. And the infrastructure, the economy, the people are still there. So I don't think it's the end of the world. It's actually a good thing to cleanse the old system. So with that, maybe you could calm the viewers, because people get worried. What am I going to do if this happens? My feeling is that it probably wouldn't last for too long. The really bad hyperinflation, it would be a peak, maybe at the most 18 months, and then things would start recovering. So could you tell us, I know Romania is completely different than Western Europe, but I think it's still a pretty advanced economy. I've looked up. It's in the top 30, I think, in terms of GDP per capita and total GDP. So it's a pretty advanced economy. But what was the most important thing during the economic collapse in Romania and the hyperinflation in terms of survival, in your opinion?
Sure. I would just like to mention two things that you touched upon. One was that the infrastructure remains there even during hyperinflation. It isn't necessarily always so, because the factories, a lot of the buildings and everything sort of deteriorates during these times. And to mention, Romania did not have any international debt when we went into hyperinflation. And after hyperinflation, we had multi-generational debt that we still have and probably won't ever be able to pay off. So certainly things that you think are there will no longer be there, in sense that the economy and the engine of the economy was completely broken up, sold to foreign investors, and breaking down. And the second thing was that this could be a training. What is happening at that kind of hit the nail on the head from my point of view, because whatever happened during the pandemic and during these years, a lot of bells rang that, oh, I already lived through this once, and oh, I already felt this, especially in the United States with the shortages. And even as funny as it is, with toilet paper shortage, we had that. So we already, any Romanian can tell you that we had that, whether it was hacked pipelines or something like that. And of course that could be true. No, I'm not questioning that, but saying like having these shortages during Romania actually helped us prepare. And I could think that this could be also used as an opportunity to kind of do stress tests on yourself and your family, or even on your business. How would you fare if the pipeline would break down again? Or what would you do if there would be food shortages? Because we did see a lot of these calamities in time. The frequency of the problems would kind of indicate that some bigger issue is coming down the road. So I would totally agree on that. Most important thing was having connections, having family, and having that the framework in place to help others and others helping you was probably the most important things. As you mentioned, as hyperinflation, as bad as it can get, or as bad as it can be, people lived through worse times in history, right? So it wasn't like our hyperinflation wasn't as bad as the hyperinflation that my grandmother lived through, or, you know, a couple of 100 years back. Again, it was different. But what did they have, right, that we might not have? It was usually self-reliance, connections, and just the capabilities of taking care of yourself and your loved ones, and not relying on centralized solutions. So that was there before, and that is why they could live through these times, and that is why we could live through these times, because the family unit and even the social structure of Romania was completely different, where since then we have more went into an individualized, a more compartmentalized, and a different path, I should say, where people are more reliant on these bigger services, bringing you the parcels, right? Ordering something online, you thinking that you're able to take care of yourself just because these structures and frameworks are in place. But once these break down, you will see what actually human nature is when these things are missing. So being prepared for that, knowing what your neighbor is, what your neighbor's capabilities are, who would need help in this situation, having connections with family is, I would say, the most important thing, because if you have this network of people, then you can live through almost anything, I would say.
Yeah, that's what I thought was really important when you said that. The community, going out and being nice to people. So making more friends with your neighbors. Yeah, the other day I was reading, well, actually it was yesterday it came out. They're talking even in the UK now because of this problem with the pinging the app. They call it a pingdemic. There are people warning that we could have food shortages because people working at food processing plants might not be going to work and they might have to shut it down. So yeah, maybe they are doing this as a trial run and getting people to get ready, because I think in 2019, that's when the financial crisis really started, not in 2020, because I don't know if you follow the markets that much, but we had the repo crisis in September of 2019, and the Fed had to stop unwinding the balance sheet. They had to stop raising rates, and they used to call it not QE. And then all of a sudden, we have this crisis, and it gives them the excuse in March to start, doing massive amounts of QE. Their balance sheets go from 3.5 trillion. That now we're over 8 trillion. So I think they might have known in 2019, if we have to do all this QE to save the system again, we're going to have hyperinflation right away. What's the way to delay that a little bit? Maybe, well, we shut down the economy, and maybe that's how they found an excuse or a reason for this crisis. I don't know, but could we maybe go over a little bit of things like prepping? Because I thought what you said the other day in one of your videos was quite interesting, to start small. So could you elaborate a little bit for the viewers? Because you've given me some ideas, but you have a lot more experience, of course, with that.
Sure. Just to iterate on your idea, I do believe that the pandemic and all of these issues that we had a strong deflationary effect that could have offset a hyperinflation that was in the brewing, and they might even overdo it with completely stopping the economy to point where I believe there could be a deflation first before we go into a totally different scenario. As for prepping, so our situation was different back in Romania. Just looking at the average houses in the United States, comparing their pantry size to their closet size is completely different than what we had in Romania in our ancestral houses that were built way, way back, where the pantry was completely different. The attic could be used to store food and other items as well. But what we had was, we have been canning and farming ever since from the Middle Ages, and that was passed down to generation, and different skills for the men and the women, of course. But that was our sort of edge that we had. Much of that has been lost. And I do follow a lot of prepping shows, and I look up to some of those people, most of the people, that they do get things right. But of course, the American way is always to kind of overdo things, and then purchasing stuff that survival stuff, which is important because we don't necessarily know how bad it can get. But kind of weighing in what is the most probable, and then what is less probable in your prepping probably makes sense, because everyone has a limited budget. So doing it in small steps and having a rolling pantry would be the best in this case, because if nothing happens, you didn't bought a lot of solar cookers or some other stuff which have their own purpose in some of these scenarios, but that is more unlikely, at least in my perspective. So actually, just whatever you're accommodated to consume and buy on a weekly basis, you could stock up on those. So if you're buying, whatever soups or chicken or whatever you are familiar with, or even soap, it doesn't always have to be food, just making sure that you buy enough that if you are unable to go to the store tomorrow, you have enough for 3 months. And that might seem a lot, but it's actually not. If you think about it, you cannot store everything, but if you have skills, you can buy flour, you don't have to buy the bread, right? So having these basic skills of preparing food from the grain, from the raw food items is very important. Having a method of storing food without electricity, from root cellars to smokehouses, we had everything already in place in Romania, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone had it, but you knew someone who had it, and then you could trade or barter where you could use that smokehouse until you build your own. So whatever you're accommodated to, just having more of that makes total sense to me, to a minimum of 3 months. And that's even good if nothing happens in the sense of economic issues. It could be a hurricane, it could be outages, it could be anything. Just having that used to be normal sense, common sense back in the day. But now we have been accommodated to this modern life where we are kept up by systems, and then whatever the system asks from us, we will gladly trade, because we have a dependency on that. So not being dependent on the internet too much, not being dependent on electricity too much, and having those food items would be the best thing. But also in our case, in Romania was still mostly a rural country, so we had access to homesteads, farms that were actually producing many items. Farming in the United States now could look like it's a huge industrial farm with soybean and nothing else, acres upon acres. That was not our case. Of course, we had corn and some other stuff, but people also had their couple of acres of homesteads where they grew potatoes, where they grew vegetables, raised animals, and that sort of stuff. So having that would be really nice. Of course, I understand that not everyone can have that in the city. The best you can do is probably prep with food and tools and some other stuff, but also thinking about maybe owning some land out there, just in case if a situation would change, you have maybe a couple of months worth of resources right now so that you can get that homestead started. And our homestead was very basic. Our house there was made from mud bricks. We didn't have running water. So people will say, well, you had a homestead. Well, it was probably different than what you imagined, but it was enough to where we could go there, prepare that place and get it started within a couple of months to where it would produce. And also bartering and knowing other people helped a lot.
You said that I think you lived in the city, but the homestead was outside in the countryside. And you spoke about one of your neighbors or someone in a bloku, which is the high rises in Romania, right? That he was making wine from his balcony.
That's correct. So yeah. City life becomes rural life without the infrastructure and without, I guess, whatever people have, without the space. So it became very different. That would mean that people in the city would actually start living like folks outside of town, where they would store food wherever they could. They would sometimes butcher animal right in front of the apartment places and process the animals up in the apartment. So it changed a lot in Romania.
Yeah, I also remember you said that try to think of something that you need all the time, and maybe buy it more of that when you go out to buy stuff like clothes. So just simple things as well. I think is important. That's because you said there's a shortage of clothes in Romania, wasn't it, during that time?
Yes, definitely. So a lot of things were imported into Romania. So it was a satellite state of the Soviet Union, and it was centrally governed from Romania, but also centrally governed from Moscow, which meant that, of course, Romania was producing more food. However, maybe Kazakhstan was producing other stuff, so they would manage where we would have these treaties and other stuff during communism. And once everything kind of broke down, we didn't have a lot of stuff that would be normally produced in another Soviet state that would be imported to us. So actually clothes were different. But you have to take a look at what your country, what you can produce or what you're producing now, and what would happen if you would no longer be able to import. What are your items that that you're importing maybe from China or some other countries that you would no longer be able to afford, or even if the economic structure would break down?
Yeah, I have a feeling what we could be experiencing is the fall of the Pax Americana, because prior to the Soviet Union collapsing, it was the United States versus the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union collapsed, and Warsaw Pact countries, of which Romania was a member. All those countries, they went through a lot of difficulties. The changeover or the change from communism to whatever else came was very difficult, and all the supply chains broke. Economically, it was very difficult. We look at Cuba. Cuba had a lot of problems back then. It's having problems now as well. But I have a feeling that if there is a collapse of the dollar system, it's going to hurt a lot of Western Europe. It's probably going to even hurt Romania now, because Romania has become more dependent on that. With that, I wanted to talk about local currency substitutes, because you spoke about how in the beginning your family wasn't aware that you could have another currency that would protect you more, and that how eventually they learned that having Deutschmarks was a good thing. And it was the same thing in Brazil, growing up in Brazil, especially in the 80s and mid 80s. If you had access to US dollars, you would do okay, because even though the Brazilian currency was going down the drain, if you had dollars, you live very well. And you kind of wonder now. I personally think the substitutes for when the reserve currency, like the dollar, is in danger of collapsing could be precious metals. I know it wasn't in Romania, but could you give the viewers an idea of what happened in Romania and how you used to use the Deutschmark, and also how pricing things became really difficult, that you had to price items versus items, and that people who talk about silver now, they talk about $150 silver, but you said you might not even have a price in the dollar for silver. You have to price silver versus other things.
That's correct. So I come from a fairly poor family. We were not economically educated. We didn't necessarily know what was happening. Only by the time the inflation hit food prices, that affects us all. And at that point, we knew that something was wrong. But that was probably too late by that time, because usually food prices is one of the last things, or is probably the last things right before the salaries or something else that has to increase as well. However, what happened when the economy broke down was a lot of skilled labor actually left the country. So you could imagine that engineers, doctors who were skilled left the country completely. And where they went to? Well, the Western countries, of course, of Europe, and Germany and some other countries were as well. Skilled labor was first, but then everyone who was able to and try to work outside of the country did. And how foreign currencies were introduced to us was this way, that they sent foreign currencies back home, because you would think that you will be able to trade, but nobody wanted the Romanian lei. Nobody would actually want Romanian lei for their German marks back then, even from Germany, right? So what you would be able to trade is your own skills, or sometimes foreign investors would come and purchase up land or something like that. But we suddenly learned that, well, hey, these foreign currencies act as mediaries, act as actual currency, or could act for currency for us. So suddenly what happened, that when you were selling your car or maybe some real estate, you would actually price it in German marks and not in Romanian lei. And of course, if you worked for Romanian lei, then you would have to exchange that to something else, then that something else into German marks, and then use the German marks to purchase whatever you wanted. And that is still like that in parts of the Romania that where I came from. That was such shock back then that people still remember, and a lot of real estate in the Transylvanian part of Romania is still like that, even on websites where you would go and look for apartment buildings or something. Most of the time, actually, you will see the prices in euros. However, this was a bit later. I mean, people had to go outside, work a couple of months, maybe years. Some never came back, so on. And the influx of foreign currency was very slow. So we did use barter a lot. However, what people think about barter is that you will just go walk up to someone and ask them what you want, and then you switch products. That doesn't work like that. There has to be a certain level of trust for barter to work. So it would work mostly in smaller towns where you would be bartering from your wife's second cousin, right? Or you would have sort of verbal or non-verbal contracts that, hey, I will be working for you this weekend to raise that barn or that smokehouse or something like that. And at the end of the day, I'll have a live chicken that you will give me, and you will also come back to my place and fix the leaking roof, 2 weeks from now or tomorrow or something like that. So skills were bartered much more often than actual items. And when items were bartered, you had to have that level of trust, because you would need to know that you can rely on that person, that they will actually hold up their end of the deal. It would be very hard, because trust in government fell, but also trust between people fell a lot. So it would be very unwise to go up to someone and flash your silver or gold. Hey, what are you willing to give that to for me for this? Because they would probably know that you have more of that, and then that would be very hard to do that. We did trade silver. Gold was illegal during communism in Romania. However, people did have silver jewelry. So that was legal to hold, and people did have that. However, silver and some other precious metals were going up in price so fast that you would not want to trade that away. You would trade anything else but what is actually holding its value. So you would be trading, in our case, my family grew potatoes. We would rather want to trade potatoes, right, instead of trading silver. Now, of course, if everyone would have silver, and it would be a different scenario, and everyone would be knowledgeable of the price of silver, it could definitely act as currency. But I would think that the lower quality currencies would be more circulated instead of what you actually want to hold. When we did trade currency, it wasn't like you could go into a bank, or you would go into a house. Now we have trading houses in Romania where you can trade currency. It would be a man in an alley with two bodyguards who has the local cop paid off, and you would go there maybe with two of your friends, and you would barter a deal what you would get. And in our case, everybody sort of had the understanding, if you're trading gold or your gold jewelry, that means that you probably already traded everything else that you had, and you are desperate now. So you would not even get the fair price for that. That was definitely the situation in the early months or early years. Later on, since more of these people showed up and sort of they took opportunity of this, it got balanced out where you would get that, but people still didn't want to trade away what was actually valuable and gaining gaining value. And the relative price of things, it was very hard to know. And because regions are different. We grew potatoes, but some other regions in Romania, they grew corn or sunflower seeds. It was totally different. So the price of, now we are used to that. There's a global price. There's a commodity market. You know exactly the price of bacon, right? But that's not like that in a calamity. Everything you have to make up the price there and then, and kind of negotiate how you will trade that. So at some point, the price of the precious metals went up really high as the currency was falling, and we were losing the our trust in government. But at some point, you didn't even necessarily knew what was the price of gold or price of silver, because people didn't want to trade, and you would not know how much it is worth, right? You would, and then towards the later parts of the hyperinflation, my family was actually lucky enough that we were able to acquire some gold during hyperinflation, towards the later part, where my father was able to work for foreign currency, and we trusted gold and silver more than even the foreign currency, so we wanted to trade some of that back. However, during the early periods of the hyperinflation, we lost almost everything. And one thing that we lost right before we were able to purchase some gold was a homestead that my grandmother's sister had. And just to say that prices are very relative in these scenarios. Everything goes up in the currency. So the price of that homestead could have went up thousands times, 100 times, or even more. However, compared to gold, it actually fell, or compared to food, it actually fell. So just to give you a concrete example, was that when we had to sell that property, it was around 2 million Romanian lei. But that doesn't tell you much, because eventually 8 million lei was the minimum salary, right? So it, depending on the time frame, that could have been a lot, that could have been little. But to compare, eventually within that year, 2 million Romanian lei bought us a gold chain. So to compare the price of gold to real estate, both went up. However, relatively at that point, the price of gold was much more. And that we bought that chain as an investment, because nobody knows how long this period will go and what could happen to the German mark, because as soon as more and more German mark were flowing into the Romanian economy, even that was losing somewhat value.
One really interesting thing you talked about, and I think this is very relevant for people who are still holding a lot of local currency savings in the bank. You spoke about one of your relatives, how they'd saved so much money in the bank, and then eventually he could barely buy a black and white TV. Could you go over that a little bit?
Yes, for sure. So some relatives in the family had an inheritance from a grandfather who did very well with farming and some other stuff. And the inheritance was enough at some point, right around 89, actually, right before hyperinflation happened, was that amount of local Romanian currency could have purchased 3 regular homes in Romania without any mortgage. So cash down, they could have purchased 3 different houses. However, it was some conflict, what to do with the money, how to divide it, and what to invest it in, of course. And that money was sitting in the Czech, in the bank, the Romanian bank. And as soon as hyperinflation happened and the accounts were frozen, the bank holiday was on. By the time the currency they were able to take that out, that same amount of Romanian lei bought a black and white television set. So just to give you an idea how fast it can go. And also, to what I don't talk too much about was stocks. So because the the economy went down really bad, the companies. So in communism was a bit different. You would not be trading stocks every day, all day on apps like how we do it now. But people who worked at bigger factories, they would have shares given to them. So it would kind of be on top of the nationalized pension plan they would be able to have. But my mother's stock in the factory that she worked for, which would have been a good pension plan eventually, when she was able to cash that out. Eventually the factory went down. She was able to purchase a purse with that money. So just to say that pension plans and stocks, people think that, oh, they will always go up. Yes, in inflation, but hyperinflation is a totally different game. Pension that was provided by government kind of didn't really track inflation as well. It was always not enough, not even barely enough for food for the elderly. The company was majority state owned. However, Romania during the 80s was a totally different communist country than it was in the 50s. So communism kind of shifted between these years.
Okay. Could we go over a little bit your ideas about gold and silver? I know there wasn't much of a culture in Romania for precious metals, but what you think could happen if we were to have a hyperinflation? Because I agree with you, and even though I think a lot of the symptoms and ingredients for a hyperinflation are there, it's not guaranteed that it will happen, but we could have like inflation like in the 70s, and then someone steps in and lets rates go up to 20% like Paul Volcker, and then they'd kill the economy. There would be a collapse, but there wouldn't be hyperinflation. But you spoke about gold being timeless. I thought that was really interesting. Maybe you could go into that a little bit, because I think, like me, you are very interested in the precious metals as well.
Yes, that's absolutely true. So even during communism, we would fantasize about owning gold, or how nice it would be to have silver coins or something like that. But that was, of course, never a reality for us during Romania. However, from my grandmother's and grandfather's experience, we knew that in the previous hyperinflation, in the previous situations, or when during the war times, how well people did who were able to acquire that precious metal before the war times or before the Pengu hyperinflation, and were able to keep that. However, it became illegal during communism. So you would have to wait probably around 60 years to use that gold again if you wanted to do that in Romania. However, from our perspective, gold and silver would not be an investment that you would sell in 4 years or 5 years, or if it goes up, you sell it. Because I do see a lot of YouTube video titles that silver will go to 150 per ounce. I'm like, 150? You mean 150,000, if it's hyperinflation, but that won't matter because you don't know if that's a good price or not. So what you have to think about in these scenarios is that gold and silver, to me at least, are insurance policies that when a government collapses, or when the economy collapses, it is outside of the system. It is essentially timeless. Government goes on for a long time. As my grandmother used to say, there's never has been a song that never ended. And people lived during communism. They were born, and probably many of them died during communism, and they never saw anything else but communism. So they could have thought that it will go on forever. However, it always changes, the system always refreshes, and sort of having that gold and silver outside of the casino of governments and economies gives you that stability that you can go back to after the calamities are over. So in my perspective, being able to hold these precious metal investments through the periods where, 2 days' work was paid when a couple of pounds of potatoes. Being able to hold through this period and then use it again after the economy and government settles would be the best case to have gold and silver. So it's an insurance policy against loss of faith in government, I would say. And it would be something that you could acquire, in my opinion, you could acquire multi-generation wealth, because we knew stories about other families who did that and they did very well. Of course, that wasn't our case, but the knowledge was passed down to us as well.
Yeah, and I guess the trick is holding on to it during those periods, because that's the most difficult thing.
Yes, that's exactly what I wanted to say. So you're absolutely correct that when these calamities happen, those who have no food storage or no place to go or no connections, they will be forced to trade whatever assets they think they have, may that be even gold or silver or whatever investments that they think has value. They will need to trade that for necessities. So having that base covered, where you have those basic necessities taken care of, you have the connections, you have the ability to self-sustain or go to somewhere and build the ability then during these times, is much more important than having a lot of quote unquote investments, because it will be traded away for potatoes or corn if you're starving or if your children are starving.
Yeah, so I guess gold and silver will be ammunition for when the dust settles, so you can start again. So you might have to use a little bit of it during the crisis, but you need to try to hold on to as much of it as possible. Arpad, it was really nice having you here. I think we've almost been speaking for an hour, so I think that should be enough. I'd love to have you on the channel again. I wouldn't mind coming on your channel if you'd like. And anything you'd like to say to the viewers, some final advice or thoughts?
Thank you very much. It was nice being here. Yes, I do have a final thought, is that don't let fear take over you. A lot of these channels and a lot of people who have good intentions and they share good information do play into fear, whether they want it or not. And fear kind of locks you down or makes you do unwise decisions, or invest your money where you would not want to, or invest too much in something that you think will perform good or not. So having level head, not getting too into the world of politics, that's at least for me, but actually being able to step back a little, knowing that these scenarios do play out, but they're not one day from another. You will still have some time to prepare. And as long as you step back, take a look at things as they are, not what your perception is or what you were trained to do in good times, but look at them as they are realistically, listening to other people, other advices, and then distilling what is truth out of that. And then making your decisions is much more important than acting on fear.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you another time.